Recording. Okay, gracias, Francisco. Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gran placer para mí presentar al doctor Mark Neyrinck, que es un muy buen amigo y colaborador. El doctor Neyrinck obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de Colorado en el 2005 y después hizo estancias postdoctorales y de investigación en la Universidad de Hawái, la Universidad de Astrofísica en París, la Universidad de Durham. Actualmente es investigador de tiempo completo, es un fellow, Iker Basque Fellow en la Universidad del País Vasco en España. El doctor Mark Neyrinck es un líder en el estudio de la red cósmica y es uno de los astrofísicos más innovadores. Su trabajo abarca desde el estudio de la red cósmica y su influencia en la formación de galaxias hasta la cuantificación del universo, mapeos galácticos, etc. Y ha escrito varios códigos muy usados en la comunidad, en particular su buscador de vacíos. Es un referente desde que se ha publicado. Entre otras cosas, también hace trabajo artístico, científico. Su trabajo se ha mostrado en YouTube, se ha mostrado en el canal de Ciencia Nova, ha expuesto trabajo en la prestigiosa Galería Manresa en San Francisco, en la National Gallery en Lituania y ha presentado workshops en el Museo de Ciencias en Londres. Y bueno, ahora nos va a hablar sobre la red cósmica y filamentos, spin a cosmic web, the boundary of determinism. Bueno, doctor Neyrinck, adelante, por favor.
Sí. Buenos días. I will speak in English because my Spanish is not adequate to give a talk in. But I hope that it's okay. I guess if someone needs a bit of translation, perhaps Miguel can help. But no, I think it should be okay in English. Right, I'm going to talk about the cosmic web, which I'm sure most of you have some idea about. Miguel is there, of course. He must have told you a lot about the cosmic web, and some things will be a bit of a duplicate of what he must have said, because I work with him, and we have some similar ideas about it. But I should explain the title. So spinning a cosmic web. So that refers to this tale I'm going to tell. Spinning a web is telling a story, but also I'm going to talk about spin in the cosmic web. That's something I recently worked on with Miguel. And the boundary of determinism, that probably doesn't immediately have meaning for you, but I'll get to that. Roughly, it's a bit of a philosophical thing that I think is under people don't. I haven't run across many people talking about it before, so hopefully that'll be interesting too. So, an outline. So I'm going to talk about how there are a lot of words here. Don't worry about it too much, but I think that it's important and valuable to do a lot of multidisciplinary thought and work if possible. I've even gotten involved with art, as Miguel explained. I think it's useful to, for society, it's useful to demystify science and deepen understanding. It can enhance engagement with science. So that I think this sort of outreach thing is I don't need to explain that that's important. But also it's one thing is that one aspect of this is we need good scientific news nowadays, something that provokes awe and interest rather than just bad news about the virus and so forth and climate change. So that's number one. Number two is actually that this deepened understanding, it's not just for outreach, it actually can lead to scientific progress. So I have a little story to tell about that regarding the spin of intergalactic filaments that came through an investigation of origami. And so that's number 3, also spinning filaments. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about this philosophical question of the boundary of determinism in the cosmos. Where is the universe entirely determined from the initial conditions, and where is it mostly determined by subsequent events? Okay, so the first part of this talk is going to be a kind of a slideshow of different patterns that look like the cosmic web, which again you probably have seen from Miguel. So here is something that came from a work that we did together with many other people, neuroscientists and artists and cosmologists. So on the left here is a neuron, which is very small, and on the right is kind of well-worn picture from the Millennium simulation of the large-scale structure of the arrangement of matter in the cosmos, a very different scale, and there's some similarities and differences between them, which I won't get deeply into, but they look at first glance pretty similar. So this work led to this virtual reality experience that that maybe some people besides Miguel have seen there. I don't know, but we developed this with an artist, Anastasia Victor, who works at Oculus, and this gave an experience of trying to embody a neuron or a node of the cosmic web with some filaments. So what we did was we took an algorithm that was designed for making fake neurons in neuroscience, and adapted that to allow the controllers of a virtual reality device to guide the growth of a neuron. And it was part of a larger visualization and experience that Miguel put together that I don't have a slide about, but it was really cool, and I think it gives us a different sense of what the structure really is to try to grow a node of the cosmic web yourself. And that this algorithm actually involved a little bit of scientific research, which we're still kind of working on. It's a bit on the back burner, but this algorithm involves a balance between the structure of a neuron being given by a minimal spanning tree, which is on the left here. If we join a lot of points together, using a minimal spanning tree, minimizing the amount of material used to join those points together, we get something like this. Yeah, can you see my pointer? I just want to make sure.
Yes, we can see it, man.
You can?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So on the left, we see something that is just a minimal spanning tree of these points. But if we change the balancing factor so that we optimize the distance to the center, we get something on the right. And generally, these studies by Kuntz et al. Have found that a neuron is somewhere between those two extremes. So there's a balance between conserving material in the neuron and the communication time to the center, which is of course where the main machinery of the cell is. And we found that, well, here's a plot from that study, which you don't have to worry about crucially, but this kind of quantifies how to find that branching factor. So this on the x-axis is the number of branch points, the number of points where the branching structure branches, versus the total length of the neuron. So each of these points is a neuron, in a big scatter plot. And we found that that roughly the clusters of the cosmic web follow a similar law, which actually is, we still don't really understand why that should be, if there's a deep reason for that, or it just happens to be the way the cosmic web looks. But that is a new aspect of the science that came from this art project. Okay, so that, there are other types of structures that are also similar to neurons, such as trees. Here, well, the structure of a neuron is called an arbor, a tree. So it's been known since Ramona Cajal, which is first sort of seriously studied this, that neurons looked like a tree. Or many neurons do. Here are some leaves that also have a similar structure. Lungs also have a branching structure, and there's a reason for that that's pretty well established. There are reasons for all of these things, which are revealed when you look deeply into it. And so I think it's not as interesting to just say that something is a fractal, and that fractal patterns are common, as to and identify why this thing is a fractal. And in the case of lungs, the reason that it has this funny structure is to maximize the surface area for exchange of oxygen given a certain volume. Another thing which has both, which actually serves two purposes. One is communication, actually, in mycelium, or around trees, or well, plants. So mycelium is a fungus that that forms a branching structure for nutrient transport and also communication a little bit, it seems. It's kind of, there's been some papers about this being a very simple sort of computer, in fact. This person, Adamansky, works a lot on that. And circulatory system in the human body, or well, any substantial animal's body. So these, in the case of the circulatory system, it's similar to the lungs. It's an optimal sort of structure, or nearly optimal structure, to reach a large volume with the minimal amount of blood vessels. So you can imagine other very, like a regular grid going through the body that would not be as optimal. You would have a lot of material wasted on this kind of silly regular grid, but this fractal structure is more optimal. And okay, back to the cosmic web finally. Just as this sort of blood nerves, or sorry, this circulatory system of blood transports materials throughout the body, the cosmic web efficiently funnels matter into galaxies from an initially uniform distribution. So there's a connection there. There's another thing, yet another structure that this sort of person is looking at, a topographic map, which also has some properties of well, the structure on the map has some properties similar to that, particularly river networks and watersheds look very much like these blood systems, especially if you color them in red. So here is the watershed that is around me in Denver. It looks roughly like a circulatory system. And here is one that's more relevant for you there, assuming most of you are actually there. This is the Colorado River, watershed basin with many of the tributaries. There are even finer capillaries of the network that aren't shown here, of course, but it's sort of again a fractal structure that funnels matter most efficiently from a rough sort of uniform arrangement of water that gets deposited. Okay, and so more cosmically again, here is a video showing two watershed basins that are three-dimensional that we are nearby. So we are in this Laniakea black structure. You don't actually see the galaxies, but they're very small. So this is, I don't actually remember the scale of this, but this is many dozens of megaparsecs in size, each one of them. So that's a three-dimensional watershed which funnels matter into galaxies. So if the universe were not accelerating, I suppose most of this matter would eventually fall into this great attractor. But it is accelerating, so it probably won't do that. And then there's also slime mold. So here is a picture of some slime mold, which maybe you've heard, I don't know, happens to map out a rather efficient structure given a set of points that it wants to go to. So here is Africa and the United States. So what they did is to put a piece of oat in each of the cities and let the slime mold explore the structure, which takes a few days before it settles down to one of these arrangements. And that actually seems to be not a bad model for how to decide where filaments are in the cosmos. This is a set of filaments for funneling matter into galaxies that Burchett et al. wrote a nice paper about last year. This is in 3 dimensions, which, of course, well, these are 2-dimensional arrangements. Slime mold actually hasn't really been tested in 3 dimensions yet, but this isn't. They use this algorithm that's based on slime mold, but in 3 dimensions to map out where they thought filaments might be. And actually, this is something that has come up a little bit in the news, at least in France, where the investigators of this, the principal investigators of this project are. So there's this thing that they call le blob, which is slime mold, that is part of an experiment on the International Space Station. So they're looking at how this slime mold behaves in zero gravity, which I'm not really sure if there's a great reason for doing that besides it's a relatively easy and cheap and engaging thing to investigate. But there are actually some proposals to try to build things from a process like this. They're a bit. I'm not sure if those are near-term things. It's hard to imagine building actual structures in space from slime mold, but it's an interesting experiment, and they're just actually analyzing these right now. They're analyzing the difference between these structures that were grown on the space station and these structures that were made in schools in France. Right, so that was a bit of a digression about slime mold, but it actually is relatively convenient to try to map the structure in the local universe, the local and most nearby galaxies using this. So here is a an arrangement of galaxies has been called the Council of Giants, or it's the nearest large galaxies in the local sheet. So conveniently, the large galaxies within, or actually all galaxies really within this distance of 24 million light years of the Milky Way are in this fairly flat arrangement called the local sheet, and that fits into a petri dish nicely. So I did this during the pandemic. That it was a fun thing to do at home. So what I did was I put these oat flakes at the positions of these large galaxies and looked at how the slime mold mapped it out. And you can see how it did that. It's actually, the boundary actually was an issue here. This is in a petri dish, and it seems to have collected mostly along the boundary. When it does this, it's not a unique structure that it finds. Here are 4 mappings of the filaments in the local sheet using different colors, so that these are 4 different petri dishes with different slime molds that map the structure, and there is some correspondence, but it's not that impressive. Still, each individual realization or guess that the slime mold makes has some, visually looks like something like the cosmic web, which is interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit on the track of looking at the spin of these filaments, and that comes through origami, which is yet another art form or kind of structure that is related to the cosmic web, it turns out. And here is this is again the same structure. Maybe you can tell this is the local sheet Council of Giants, except represented with origami. So here, this is a type of origami called an origami tessellation, and that happens to also correspond to a tensile structure called a spiderweb, which I will say a few words about. So, okay, some physics of the cosmic web, finally. So we think that we're fairly sure that at the Big Bang, there was this pattern of fluctuations that were sort of served as a blueprint for the cosmic web to form in. So here is just a little video showing where different patches of the universe collapse or expand in co-moving coordinates. So here we're, of course, we're scaling out the expansion of the universe. But you can see that in these blue patches where there's not so much matter, things expand at a greater rate than the average, but the red patches collapse. And all of that is governed exactly by the density pattern initially. It's completely deterministic, and you can rather easily actually predict where different things will collapse. And you can think about this in terms of little cells that are expanding or contracting according to the local density. Or actually, it's the potential that governs this. So if the potential is if you're at a potential hill with a large potential, your cell is expanding actually like a kind of like a separate universe that is underdense. But if you're in a dense patch, you're kind of in a closed universe that is contracting, and it ultimately collapses. And this happens to correspond to a structural engineering spiderweb, which I won't get deeply into, but it's the same algorithm, which is called the adhesion model, that was used to predict the structure here also tells you how to build this out of cords or out of threads of string that will hold its structure optimally if you put some tension on it. So that's called a spiderweb in structural engineering. Here's an example of a spiderweb that someone actually constructed. An artist named Tommaso Arseno made this, scanned a small, a rather small spider web, an actual spider web that a spider had, or a bunch of spiders had woven, and so he scanned this and replicated the structure on a very large, in a room in an art installation with the help of many helpers. It wasn't just him by himself. In fact, he has an art studio with dozens of people working there. So I think I'm going to skip the technical details about this spider web analogy. And start talking about spin. Okay, so there are many things that spin in the universe, and as I said in my abstract, if you read that, basically, if something can spin, it generally does. So, while many things we're used to on Earth, we're in the rooms where we are sitting, most things are not really visibly spinning because they're attached to the ground. But if something is not attached to the ground or to something else, it is generally spinning, like like a top. We can make it spin. The Earth is, of course, spinning. The galaxy is spinning, and it turns out when you scale up to the largest possible things, things are still spinning, which is not really surprising, I don't think. But this is the first time that we actually measured this. And as I mentioned before, this actually comes, for me at least, from another artistic analogy, and that's with origami. So here is a simulation, a two-dimensional cosmological dark matter simulation that was run with this code called cold ice, and this doesn't look like most cosmological simulations that you've seen, probably. For one thing, it has much less small-scale structure, so it's mainly just the large-scale structure that you can see. But also the way that it's rendered is really that of a sheet that is collecting in some places where there's more matter, and it's evacuating in the voids. And you can really see some sharp boundaries between what we call single stream regions, where there's only one layer of the material that's there, and a multi-stream region where there are many streams of the dark matter that are going in different directions, generally, and with different velocities. So here the yellow patches are the densest places where one can imagine galaxies forming. But the reason I'm showing this is because there's a folding process that it suggests, which actually, well, going back to some artistic workshops that I've been a part of, that I've given, there are it's possible to replicate this process, at least visually, fairly well using this tool fabric. So if you gather together patches of this fabric and put rubber bands around them, generally you will find what's called a pleat between neighboring patches of the material, and that word pleat is used in fabric, in fashion, but also in origami. But here, well, you can see there's a rough correspondence in the way it looks between this and this. The pleats form here for a very different reason than the gravity that forms them here, which I won't get into, but still it ends up looking similar. And here's a workshop that I did in London. You can see this beginnings of one of these structures here, but the point of this activity was to try to replicate this Council of Giants structure, which wasn't very accurately done, but that wasn't really the point. If you restrict this material not to be able to stretch, you have origami. So that's the difference between fabric folding, which is also can be called, well, it doesn't matter. This is a stretchy material, and this is a not stretchy material, origami, where you have extremely sharp, where the fact that the material doesn't stretch constrains you to have sharp folds, straight folds. So actually, this is in mathematical terms, the process of folding one of these is called an isometry. You go from the unfolded to the folded state. It's an isometry where, except for local patches where there's a fold, each patch on the structure, it has no stretching between the initial and the final. Now, of course, I should remind you that the universe is expanding, and so we expect well, this material would be stretching globally, but each little patch, if you look at it in a co-moving way, can be approximated by something that it's not stretching. So these structures look, I would say, qualitatively like one of these things, certainly not in detail, but there's some correspondence. And you can even generalize this to 3D, which I've done. So here is a node of the cosmic web that, if you don't allow the dark matter sheet, as it's called, to stretch, it folds in this way to make a node that generally spins. And so here is a set of two nodes that has a filament between them. In this origami toy model, the spinning of one of these nodes is linked not 100% necessarily to a neighboring node. So that generally means that if you have, well, in this model that's very idealized, nodes of the cosmic web spin if and only if a filament between them spins, or if and only if, well, a galaxy generally is, or a dark matter halo is spinning if and only if there's some rotation in some of its filaments. So that prompted us to look for more realistic filaments. So you can see Miguel here looking angelic with the 3D print. So what we did was we looked at dark matter halos in the Millennium simulation, and also a few other simulations to check. But these results are from the Millennium simulation. And what we found is, indeed, between nearby pairs of halos, generally around 6 megaparsecs away, but it doesn't. But also, it would have worked with smaller separations. If we pick the sign of the measurement to align with the rotation, and stack the velocity fields between neighboring halos, we end up with this swirling structure, a rotating, there's some rotation. So here is a velocity field from that stack along the filament, and here's a side view. So that may have been a little bit subtle. If we just blindly stack the velocity fields from various halos and align them together, and generally they will cancel out because different depending on the orientation of the filament, we could get rotation in either direction. But if we constrict if we pick the sign of each pair such that it's giving some rotation, then we end up with a rotation in the ensemble, the stack of all of this of the filaments, which is a little bit trivial. Basically, we're in some ways you can think of that as averaging a bunch of numbers together that could be positive or negative. If we take the absolute value of all of them and take the average, we will get an average positive number. But we did check that this rotation is much larger than you would expect from a random patches of the simulation. So this is a real phenomenon. And one question is, how fast do they spin? And the mean happens to be very close to the age of the universe, at least in this simulation for this particular filament sample, but it has a high that's a period of rotation. So a lot of these have not completed even a single rotation. So I guess for the very slow rotating things, you could say that the rotation is pretty modest, but there's a high rotation tail up to 1/10 of the age of the universe. So many of these have actually completed rotations. It's also complicated because the cosmic web is always evolving, so these filaments are changing, but there is a substantial rotation. And even more excitingly, this was quickly observationally confirmed. So here is a work in Nature Astronomy by Wang, Libeskind, Temple et al., in which they did something pretty similar to our broadly similar to our measurement. Here they looked at galaxies in redshift space and saw that, just like in this kind of weird umbilical cord, generally one side of cosmic filament tends to be going away from us, and in this redshift space measurement, so one side is redshifted and one side is blue shifted, implying that there's a rotation. That's actually not the only way that you could get this. You could have something that's just tilted physically in real space, but actually this amplitude of rotation is similar to what we found in the simulation of dark matter. So I think that's a pretty good clue that at least many of these filaments that they found are genuinely rotating structures. Okay, so I think I have only like 5 minutes or so left, or maybe 10. I'm going to say a little more, something about indeterminacy, which is probably the biggest jump in topic that I've gone through. But it's something I've been thinking about recently, actually independent of the pandemic. But an example of something that's very random, it seems, is the COVID pandemic. It's probably not a bad approximation that there's some small probability of a pandemic every year. So it's supposedly a once-in-a-century event. So there's 1 in 100 chance or something of a pandemic happening, maybe growing more likely now that there are more humans and there's more travel. But anyway, we can approximate this. We can approximate a bad pandemic as something that has some low probability of chance of happening every year. And if you think about it, there's probably no connection between the pandemic happening in 2020 or in 2019 and the initial conditions of the universe. This sort of thing, even though it has a huge effect on the people on Earth and even on the Earth itself. So here is a an example of what turning off, well, what the big lockdown in China at the beginning of 2020 did to pollution. So there's a feedback on the planet also from this pandemic. There was the pattern of pollution changed, which affects the weather and so forth. So this thing that was not, so my statement is that the activities on Earth basically have no connection to the initial conditions of the universe, which I hope is not really controversial, but it's something that astronomers don't tend to think about very much. But actually, the one reason for this high degree of stochasticity or chaos, so that there's a kind of complicated relationship between chaos, which is deterministic, and stochasticity, which actually has true randomness in it. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two, but there's actually something that I didn't know about until getting into this, which is something that kind of goes between, is kind of, I think, a link between stochasticity and chaos. So in a chaotic system, you could have a small amount of initial information which gets amplified, which gets sort of obfuscated by a bunch of dynamics. So you end up with something that looks very complicated, but is actually given by a small amount of initial information. Whereas you could also have the same kind of structure arising from random processes. But there's something called the real butterfly effect, which is similar to something called spontaneous stochasticity, which is related to the butterfly effect. Here's the butterfly, which is maybe the first thing that you saw on this slide. And what the true or real butterfly effect is that you can get large differences in the final conditions so here's a statement that I wrote here. In these simulations by Thalabard et al., you can have large differences in the final conditions, which are represented by the y-axis on this plot. So this is separation between initially nearby mass elements. So you can get large differences in the final conditions, and if you trace those back to the initial conditions, they're the same size no matter how nearby you shrink the differences in the initial conditions. So the usual butterfly effect is, it's kind of assumed that if you shrink the size of the butterfly, which is producing a tornado at some other place at some other time, if you shrink this butterfly, eventually the perturbation will go to zero. But actually it's a bit more common that even any non-zero perturbation to an initial conditions will end up with a similar change in the final conditions. So that's kind of a stochastic situation, even though formally this is a deterministic system. So that was just an argument that you actually can get something that looks a bit like stochasticity, even from a tiny perturbation in a deterministic system. So it's a question whether this is true in determinism. These people have argued that in a turbulent system, just a little bit of quantum indeterminism, and it can propagate to macroscopic scales and produce this sort of behavior that produces true stochasticity on macroscopic scales. So there's the question of what terrestrial events were predetermined. I would say not many of them. Whereas life, were humans predetermined, and was even the solar system prescribed in the primordial universe? I would say probably not. there's probably just some distribution of solar systems that ours is not an atypical example of, given the initial conditions. But so it is a bit ironic that, or funny that the solar system, which used to be the prime example of orderly processes, the cosmos, meaning orderly, that actually, even though it is very orderly on human timescales, was not deterministically determined. I would. This is actually an open question, as far as I know, to what degree our solar system was predetermined. But I think it's likely that it may not have been. But if we zoom out to even larger scales, we do reach a regime finally where things seem to have been simply related to the initial conditions. So yeah, here's this blueprint again. And this goes back to another slide that I showed before about separate universes. Each little patch of the universe, until it collides with another patch of the universe, which happens here, evolves completely, basically, according to the Friedmann equations, and it's very simply predictable. And one way to understand this is that in the cosmic web, where there is rotation and infall and crossing, there's a scale of the growth of perturbations that that is basically given by the crossing time. So that it could be a huge crossing time, but in principle, in these filaments, there is a crossing time. But outside of there's no crossing time where patches haven't run into each other. And in the current model, about a few percent or 1% of the dark matter will never cross. So there are some patches, we think, that will continue to evolve laminarly forever. And what this is just going to show you that a very simple algorithm gives a good approximation to a rather time-consuming n-body simulation. So this is a one-step approximation that I worked on. There are other ones that perform similarly, where these black points, which are in the voids, are essentially perfectly given by this one-step approximation, but you have to work a lot harder to get the information in the collapse structures and in the halos, and that's so. There's a this relates also to Kolmogorov information and the amount of processing that you have to do to get a given result. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. Don't worry. This 59 out of 21 is completely wrong. I'm working on a project with Shai Janelle, who wrote this paper a couple years ago about galaxies. How much? Well, the point of the paper was not quite as philosophical as I have been saying. This earlier paper was kind of giving the kind of the nature versus nurture. How much of galaxies' properties are do we really know in an n-body or in a hydrodynamic simulation? So here he used a small version of the illustrious TNG simulation, or the code for that, and put tiny perturbations at redshift 5 throughout the simulation, and observed that many of the galaxies actually had different morphologies at low redshift, just because he put these tiny perturbations at in 1 to the 10 to the 15, so that's just above the machine precision. And actually, if you don't even put these perturbations in, you still can get and change the random number seed, give that determines how stochastic processes happen in the galaxy. For example, you can get differences in the final morphology. Now, of course, those stochastic processes that are in the simulations are explicitly stochastic. There are stochastic recipes treating subgrid physics that obviously produce some differences, but I would say it's not really clear how much of that is physical. There's kind of an assumption, I think, that most of it is not actually physical, but it's something that we have to put in numerically. But I would say that it's kind of undetermined whether there might be a bottleneck of information flow in, say, an AGN, where a little fluctuation in the accretion disk that could have could arise from a quantum difference, or it's not totally clear that when when a slight difference in the accretion disk goes through this bottleneck in scale at the black hole and comes out as a relativistic jet, that tiny difference might not be enough to excite a difference in the jet that would ultimately lead to some differences in detail, probably not as large a difference as this, but some differences in where stars will ultimately form. Okay, so I'm done. I don't have a conclusion about this. I'm still even writing the paper about it, but if I were to guess about where the cosmos was stochastic, chaotic, and deterministic, I would say that the cosmos is deterministic in the voids, although even there you can get outflows in the voids, which in principle could change things a bit. But crucially, because the density is so low, a small perturbation doesn't actually amplify in a void. It just stays there. So it doesn't really drive chaos. It just is a perturbation. But then as you get to denser and denser regions, especially in galaxies, you reach a point where I think at least it's worth asking the question whether some of it might actually be stochastic. And that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to answer some questions.
Gracias, Mark. Bueno, vamos a agradecer a Mark por su plática. Muy interesante, Mark. Y tenemos preguntas. Déjenme, ya saben, levante la mano, por favor, si tienen alguna pregunta. Yo tengo una pregunta. I have a question, Mark.
Yeah.
I have a few, actually. So in your one of your last slides, so these galaxies that look so different, the initial difference was really small. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we see these papers, these comparison papers on hydro simulations, no, where they compare different codes to see different galaxies. So even a very, very small difference in the code will produce a very different galaxy, no, according to what you show.
Yeah, and I think this was probably one of the worst different. There weren't really good statistics in this paper about how many galaxies had substantial differences, but this was a galaxy that had a substantial difference. Yeah.
Okay, so it's good to note that.
Yeah.
Even a tiny difference in the way the code works could produce a very different galaxy just from this.
And even as some of you may know, the way that the simulation gets distributed into different cores can produce a difference in the a different result. So you can actually have the exact same initial conditions with no perturbations added. And you can have different answers. And in detail, of course, it all looks the same, but particle positions can be different. So the gadget code, for example, that is used for dark matter simulations, does have a mechanism that makes it deterministic. So it prescribes how the different particles are put on different processors. So you don't end up with differences. But if you didn't do that, you would get some differences.
Okay, thanks. Julieta, adelante, por favor.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not showing myself. I'm in pajamas. I'm wondering if the filaments are twisted. If the rotation of the cosmic web as a whole will exist, is different sections of the cosmic web are spinning at different velocities or directions, or are the filaments being twisted? Thank you. It was a wonderful lecture.
Oh, thanks. That's kind of an open question. I think the answer is yes, there's some twisting in general. Most of the filaments, I think, are not well described by this average structure that's just a solidly rotating vortex or whatever it is. So yeah, there's probably a wide range of geometries and rotations and twisting that happens. Miguel may have an opinion about that too. I don't know.
Please, Miguel.
Julieta, I can show you when you come to Ensenada some visualizations of rotating filaments on virtual reality.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Almost all filaments are rotating to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
This is fantastic. Congratulations to both of you. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Gracias, Julieta. Yuri, adelante, por favor.
Yes, I also joined the compliments for the super nice talk. It's not really my field, so I have a very, well, it's just curiosity. You showed the comparison between, I think it was 2D and body simulation with your one-step calculation, let's say. And you said the voids immediately got, and the others not really. How long would it take, and do they converge to something similar to the n-body?
Well, to get something very similar to the n-body, you really need an n-body simulation. It's not known how to accurately predict the structure within the collapsed structure, within the collapsed regions. But it's easy to do outside of the collapsed regions.
Okay.
But I suspect that there's probably some algorithm that can predict to some degree the structure within the collapsed regions without doing a full n-body simulation. I've thought about that, but I don't know of one that works.
Yeah, that was sort of my question. That would be a huge step forward. I mean, it would speed up.
Right. There are some perturbative techniques that, for example, Stefan Colombi and Turia have worked on that are not as information, don't take quite as much computation as a full n-body simulation, and they resolve the first couple of crossings rather well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wait. More questions? Otherwise, I have another question.
Okay.
So Mark, you mentioned the Spiderweb analysis that is being used in architecture, right? So I remember once you mentioned the cosmic web itself is a system that minimizes energy, and once you mentioned that this could be probably used also for architecture, the cosmic web itself, the structure that we see. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't think I'll have really profound insights about that, but indeed this one thing that I can firmly say is that this mechanism, this structural engineering formalism that also can be used in cosmology, tells you how much material to put in each of the threads of a structure, so that this can either be something that's in tension like a spider web, or a truss work that is in compression, that if everything is compression, is in compression. So in this correspondence, the thickness of a link in the spider web relates to the mass of a filament that is collapsed. But I actually don't really know of a good relation to the energy of the structure. I think what you said, Miguel, is probably right, that there is some way that these structures conserve energy or minimize energy. I do think that, well, it seems that that these structures are nearly optimal for transporting matter into collapsed regions in some way, but that's a bit of a vague statement. I haven't figured out what the precise statement is that would be true.
Okay, thanks, Mario. It's nice to see all this intersection between large-scale structure and the world at smaller scales. Okay, any more questions? Okay, if not, it's already 11:07 here. So let's thank Mark again. Mark, thank you very much for your talk. Oh, wait, we haven't. Yeah. So thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
It was nice to see you, and thank you.
So we see you next week. There will be our last, well, it will not be a colloquium. It will be our last meeting of the year. And have a safe week, everybody.